Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. Data released by the US Treasury Department reveals the alarming news that the US debt balance has exceeded the legal limit, implying a debt default on US Treasuries. China still holds $933.6 billion in US Treasuries, and this portion of its investment may be suffering in three ways. First, the US debt exceeds the limit. According to official US data, the US debt has exceeded the legal limit of $31.4 trillion, reaching $31.41 trillion, and the outstanding debt balance exceeds the maximum limit set by Congress, implying a debt default on US Treasuries. Earlier news showed that the debt balance was $3.136 billion as of December 1st, or one trading day later, when the debt increased by $50 billion again, finally breaking the legal limit. However, the data is constantly changing, and as long as the US officials take timely action, they should be able to reduce the debt balance as soon as possible and fall back under the legal limit again. It is expected that the US Congress will pass new legislation to raise the debt ceiling again. And this happened last December as well. The previous debt ceiling was set at $28.9 trillion, but the ceiling was hit at the end of October last year, and then the US House of Representatives and Senate finally raised it to $31.4 trillion after some wrangling. But it is unexpected that just a year later, the limit was exceeded once again. Second, the US debt fell. Perhaps the first aspect of the losses caused by the constant raising of the US debt ceiling is medium to long term, but the other two losses borne by US bondholders are happening right now. So far this year, the losses from holding US debt have come from the falling price of US debt and the shrinking assets in US debt. Normally, when we mention stocks, we always say that the stock price has gone up or down, which means we have made or lost money. But the US uses a very artistic way of describing the trend of US bonds, not talking about the rise and fall of US bond prices, but only about the rise or fall of US bond yields. So the 10-year US bond yield was less than 1.5% at the beginning of the year, and has reached more than 4% some time ago, and recently, although it has fallen slightly, it is still as high as 3.5%. Uninformed investors may think, after comparison, that it is a good thing that the US bond yield is now so much higher than at the beginning of the year. But in fact it is the opposite. The rise in US bond yields means that the price of the US bonds held is falling. As we can see from the monthly K chart above of an ETF that invests exclusively in US bonds year to date, the net value of this ETF has been declining throughout FY 2022. It closed at $26.68 at the end of December last year, compared to a low of $22.13 some time ago, a 17% drop. Note that US bonds, once considered one of the safest investments in the world, are now down by an actual maximum of 17%. At the beginning of the year, the total value of US debt held in China was still more than 10,000 billion. If there is no operation has been held until now, the loss may reach 170 billion US dollars. Do not need to wait until the US debt default. The holder has already suffered this loss. Third, the negative return on US bonds. Another aspect of the loss, which we cannot ignore, is the loss caused by US inflation. At the beginning of the year, the yield of US bonds was below 1.5%, and now it reaches 3.5%. We calculate that the interest income that can be earned by holding US bonds is 2.5% according to the average of 2.5%. But so far this year, US inflation has exceeded 8% in most months, peaking at 9.1%. If we take the average of 8%, the income from holding US bonds will be completely swallowed by inflation, resulting in a negative return of 5.5% instead. This is equivalent to holding US bonds, but to the US government subsidized interest, so it is no wonder that even the US allies Japan is also selling US bonds on a large scale. Of course, this year, China has also been selling US debt, the cumulative amount of sales of more than $140 billion. The massive sell-off has led the US government to become more and more nervous, keeping an eye on China's selling behavior and even reminding China to exert pressure in a sideways manner. As a result, in the first 2 months, China suspended the sale of US debt and instead increased its holdings by a small amount of $4 billion. At present, China's holdings of US debt have become a common concern for both sides. Should it continue to sell for its own benefit, or should it continue to hold to ease the conflict between the two sides? Let's just say that the instability of the US economy will have a great impact on the world, and the global economic development situation in 2023 is not expected to be too good. China is trying to find ways to stabilize the situation, while the United States, the only thing on its mind is its own hegemony, and this behavior will eventually backfire on itself. Some investors say what will happen if the US economy continues not to improve and the US government mercilessly prints $28 trillion and pays it all back. Experts have the answer to this. Paying off the US debt by printing a lot of money is impossible because the US government cannot afford the consequences. First, the availability of large amounts of dollars would devalue the dollar and lead to hyperinflation. Zimbabwe is a little-known African country, but in the 1980s it was known as the breadbasket of Africa, and its economy was highly developed. At the time, one Zimbabwean dollar could be exchanged for $1.47, showing how well developed Zimbabwe's economy was. However, the good times didn't last long, as Zimbabwe's economy was devastated after decades of civil war, and in 2000, the country's leaders came up with a trick, printing money to ease the economic crisis. At the time, it cost $5 trillion to travel on public transport, and banks had issued new $100 trillion in maximum denominations. Finally, in 2009, Zimbabwe finally gave up its currency and used the US dollar as the common currency. The United States really isn't afraid of inflation at all. You know, the dollar is the world's currency. In a sense, the Federal Reserve plays the role of the World Bank, and its every move will involve the world economy. The inflation generated by the US issuing more than dollars can be spread around the world for the most part. This is because the total amount of world goods is relatively stable. When the US overloads, there will be more dollars circulating in the market and global prices will naturally soar. While higher global prices will also have some impact on the US, the impact on other countries will be greater than before, and their currencies will depreciate faster than the dollar. Based on this premise, theoretically, the more dollars the US remits, the more other countries will suffer. However, China's domestic inflation is not that severe. Thus, other countries become leaks for the US to cut. The US will reap as it pleases. As we all know, China is known as the factory of the world, and it will inevitably use a lot of dollars in its international trade activities. When buying raw materials, China must use the dollar. After the goods are processed and sold to the US, the currency received will still be the US dollar. If China continues to issue dollars, then the dollar will also shrink. China is busy before and after this and will have less and less income. In the view of the United States, printing money does not satisfy its greed. In order to keep the American people rich in the long run, the US also sells its treasury bonds to the world. The US debt currently held by China has become a common concern for both sides. Should it continue to sell for its own benefit, or should it continue to hold to ease the conflict between the two sides? Let's just say that the instability of the US economy will have a great impact on the world, and the global economic development situation in 2023 is not expected to be too good. China is trying to find ways to stabilize the situation, while the United States, the only thing on its mind is its own hegemony, and this behavior will eventually backfire on itself.